and welcome to our guests. This is the third discussion part of our week-long seminar questioning what is next with the architecture students of Studio Adam Caruso at the ETH Zürich. This afternoon, we get closer to the theme of food and the city, which we will discuss with our three guests. So we welcome Carolyn Steel. She was trained as an architect. She's the author of the two books, Hungry City and Sitopia, that describes the city through the lens of food. She explores food as a power force and great connector at different scales, shaping our bodies, habits, homes, cities, landscapes, and climate. Carolyn is visiting lecturer at Cambridge and Wageningen universities and has been teaching at Cambridge and London Metropolitan Universities and the London School of Economics. Our second guest, Yvonne Latcher, works on the question of nutrition strategies for the future. She studied biology, microbiology, immunology, and agricultural science. Since 2018, she is project leader of sustainable food strategy for the city of Zurich. She focuses on collecting data and assessing the influence of infrastructures which deal with the distribution and trade of food. And with us in the room, Laura Schälchi. She is one of the co-founders and director of La Flore, a chocolate manufacturer in Zurich. The company was founded in Zurich 2 years ago and is based on the three business strategies: production, gastronomy, and events. They aim to produce high-quality chocolate within a transparent production chain. So again, welcome everyone, and I will hand off to Carolyn Steel. Thanks.
Thanks very much. It's great to be here, and I shall crack on because I know we're on a tight time schedule. So here's the technical bit. I'll share my screen, and I'll just check that you can see my screen and hear me. If people could nod or something.
Yeah, no, it's fine.
Excellent. I'll crack on then. Thank you very much for that introduction. I indeed am an architect who has, for the last 20 years, seen the world through the lens of food. And what does that mean? Well, it really means that food is an extraordinarily powerful force shaping our lives, the effects of which we often can't see because they're everywhere. And maybe my favorite image to sort of sum up what our relationship with food is all about is this fantastic fresco by Ambrogio Lorenzetti, which talks about the relationship between the city and the countryside. And, you know, if you study this thing closely, which obviously in 10 minutes we won't have time to do, but it's kind of all about food, and it's all about the relationship between the urban part of civilization and the sort of modified landscape that we call countryside that feeds it. And I think it's very interesting and significant that this fresco, which is very unusual, by the way, in representing the city and the countryside in balance, is called The Allegory of the Effects of Good Government. And I hope we can come on and discuss the implications of that later. It all goes back to the oldest question that we as a species have faced, and indeed every living being faces, which is the question of how to eat. Uniquely as a species, we've harnessed various technologies that have totally transformed our habitat as a result of getting better and better, or you could say worse and worse, at asking this or answering this question. Again, we will, I hope, be able to discuss that. But the real sea change for us came with the discovery of fire, which not only allowed us to cook food and therefore sort of, well, basically get much more calorific intake and therefore specialize in hunting and therefore develop much bigger brains, but also to socialize around a focus, which is Latin for fire, so to create a home in the wilderness, and also to create what I believe is still our best, most open and flexible economy, which is the economy of the shared meal. Of course, we progressed to living in cities, and again, a subject that I just want to introduce to you because I hope we can come back to it in our discussion later. That's Aristotle there. And he was one of the first, along with Plato, to really ask the question of, you know, sort of, as it were, from a practical point of view, how a city could feed itself. Obviously, we've leapt on from being hunter-gatherers to being farmers and urbanists. And I've cut out what would normally be half an hour's worth of lecture to get here. But basically, Aristotle called us political animals, which I think is a really interesting phrase, because it sums up the fact that we have an inherent duality, that we need society and therefore we build cities and live in them on the one hand, but we also need nature because we're animals, and therefore in a real sense we really dwell in nature even if we think of ourselves as urban. And he had this term, or the Greeks had this term, oikonomia, which basically means household management. And the idea of that is that the ideal is for every citizen to have a house in the city and a farm in the countryside, and the farm feeds the house, and therefore if every citizen is in that position, the city can be self-sufficient. And this, for both Plato and Aristotle, was the ideal for the state. Now, leaping through vast amounts of stuff, essentially we've evolved from modifying nature through fire to farming, and then to industrial farming. And in the process of doing that, we've gone from what I call living in the larder, in other words, living in the space that feeds us without modifying it very much, to radically modifying it in the form of farms, and then of course to living in cities and actually being deeply distanced from the places that grow our food. Meanwhile, our everyday life has changed. It's very interesting to me that most hunter-gatherer societies don't have a word for work, because kind of feeding yourself and doing useful stuff is more or less what you spend your day doing, through to a sort of crafts-based life in farming, through to what most of us now do, which is kind of sit staring at a screen all day. And we've seen this as progress historically, but of course enormous questions loom. In other words, we already know that our jobs are being taken over by robots, and that we ourselves are becoming sort of dehumanized because we don't kind of work physically anymore. And, you know, we do what David Graeber, the great late David Graeber, called bullshit jobs. And this is from the wonderful film WALL-E, where a very worried robot is visiting humans who are now too fat to walk on a planet that they've created because they've trashed Earth. A lot of this is predicated on the invention of, for me, a very pernicious illusion, which is that there can be such a thing as cheap food. We pay less for our food than at any time in history. But actually, if you think that food consists of living things that we nurture and then kill in order that we can live, it becomes very clear that there can't be such a thing as cheap food, because if you cheapen food, you cheapen life. And these are just some of the externalities that we've allowed, if you like, to maintain this illusion of cheap food, everything from climate change to the sixth mass extinction. The world's turning into a hamburger. Again, I hope we can talk about why this is and how this is. It's about it's about politicians having lost control of the food system and having handed it over to food industries, and all the profits to be made in food are made in basically highly processed food. Right, you know, you don't make much selling some people raw carrots, but if you can sell them a packet of Pringles, then you're winning, kind of thing. Also, anyway, I haven't got time to go into this. I've got a stop clock on, it's very, very salutary. Of course, COVID has been a big wake-up call in many ways. It's taught us that we're in this together. I mean, you know, 50 years ago, Marshall McLuhan was talking about the global village. Now we're kind of living it, for good or ill. I think COVID has revealed many inherent fragilities that were already very obvious if you were looking. This is, you know, the 47 million people in India who were forced to migrate back to their villages from cities under lockdown. Of course, COVID itself is a result of our encroachment on parts of the wilderness where we kind of really shouldn't be, and the loss of biodiversity in our own habitats. The huge inequalities that it's exposing. So, you know, key workers or people who have to sort of turn up at meat factories are the most vulnerable. And also the fact that in rich countries like Britain, and in fact all over Europe, there's been a crisis of getting the food out of the ground because the migrant labour we normally rely on hasn't been able to get here. So they're all sort of instances of fragility, but there have also been very interesting instances of resilience. So an increase in neighborliness, in people rediscovering the joy of spending time at home with their kids and so on, not rushing around like mad hamsters, new local food networks that have sprung up more or less overnight, and an increased interest in growing your own food. And of course, you know, these are sitting alongside a lot of radical deprivation that we're also seeing. So I'm not saying it's all lovely middle class sourdough world, but anyway. I think it's very interesting. COVID is bringing us back to this wonderful quote from Cedric Price. In essence, technology is the answer, but what was the question? And I think what thinking through food teaches us is that we really the question is the same. The question is how should we eat? But that question is the same question as how should we live? How to eat and how to live are really, they're like this. They're intimately bound with one another. So we haven't really escaped from the old utopian question of how do you bring the city and the country satisfactorily together? And in fact, if you look at all of these utopian models, that's what they're all essentially trying to do. The only problem with all of that is that utopia doesn't exist. And that is why I invented this word Sitopia, which just means food place, because we definitely do live in a world shaped by food, which we heard in the introduction. So our bodies, our minds, our landscapes, our cities, our homes, our economies and politics are all shaped by food. We just live in a bad Sitopia because we don't value food. So we've tended to go for these solutions on the right. But basically there are a series of choices. How are you going to produce your food? That's a concentrated animal feeding operation. That's animals fed on grain. You're going to go into the city to meet humans when you buy your food, or leave it in the name of convenience, or just dye it up on Deliveroo. You're going to take time to eat with others, or just stuff it down your face in a car. There's another really interesting dilemma question to do with technology versus craft. I love this quote from Rob Reinhardt: worrying about something as simple as food in the digital age is weird. That encapsulates the techno-fix mentality. For me, it's all about valuing food and remembering the true value of food, which is the most precious thing in our lives. And it's ironic this tends to happen in a crisis, as it did in these examples here. It's about working with and not against nature. I think that debate is over. It's about democratizing the food system, which is highly monopolistic. And it's about bringing food back into our minds when we plan how we're going to live. This is my metaphor for a good society, one in which everyone gets to eat well. And it's about seeing the world through the lens of food. And that's my book, in which you can find out a lot more about that. That was 10 minutes, wow.
Thank you for that. Do you want to go on with your presentation?
Hello?
Yeah, we can hear us. Do you want to share your screen?
Are you talking to me? Sorry, I missed the...
Yeah, do you want to go on with your presentation?
Yes, I'd like to. Let me just quickly share my screen. So here we go. Can you see my screen now?
Yes.
Well, it starts at the end. That's not the intention. So let's see again. I'm sorry. I have to start over, which is not working. Okay. Ah, there you go. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Still. Okay, I'm sorry for that. I don't know why I jumped to the end, but well, anyhow. Well, it's a pleasure to speak to you. I'm responsible for the sustainable food strategy of the city of Zurich, as was already mentioned. And so I will start with, why does a city like Zurich give itself a food strategy? What is the reasoning and also the legitimation? Fortunately, in Zurich, we have a very strong legitimation. We have a background in politics. There was a popular vote on this topic in 2017, where people could actually vote about the question whether they want Zurich to foster more sustainable nutrition or not. And luckily, 60% of all people in Zurich said, yes, we would like the city to improve the sustainability also in our food and food system. there are also various other city strategies that are already adopted, like the 2000 Watt Society and also the Master Plan for Environment. And of course, in those strategies, food is also a very important topic. I will show you why food is such an important topic a bit later. And then there are also some international agreements. So also the international levels have recognized food as a very important topic for more sustainability. And the City of Zurich has signed also the Milan Urban Food Policy Pact that addresses specifically cities to occupy themselves with their food systems. And of course, there are always also the Sustainable Development Goals that also address food on various goals and topics. So all of those different subjects and requirements we tried to weight and bring together in the Sustainable Food Strategy that the City Council adopted last July. This was the political background, but I think much more important, or at least for me as a natural scientist, is also the importance of food itself. So kind of the facts background. Why do we talk about food and sustainability? It's because it's responsible for about 20% of the CO2 emissions of the average Swiss citizen, and about 1/3 of the environmental footprint. So 1/3 of our environmental footprint means biodiversity loss, of course, CO2 emissions, then also ecotoxicity, land use, all those topics combined together into the environmental footprint. And 1/3 of that is based on our food consumption. If we take a closer look at this third, we can see that 4 groups of food are mainly responsible for this footprint. So this is mainly meat and fish. I think most people know about that. But then also the beverages. This is mainly due to coffee and alcohol. Then dairy and eggs, and fat and oils. When we look at cereals and fruits and veggies, which is the basis of our food, we see that they contribute much less to the environmental footprint. This is actually quite lucky, because when we talk about food, we don't only want a healthy environment, we also want healthy people. So we can't avoid talking about healthy people when we talk about food. And what is a healthy nutrition? When we look at the Swiss recommendation, it is nicely, or not so nicely, summarized in this Swiss food pyramid. So this is the ideal of a healthy nutrition. When we look at what people actually do, we can see that this pyramid is not keeping its original shape. So people in Switzerland, on average, eat, not surprising, too much sweet and salty. They eat not so optimal composition of fats and protein sources, namely too much from animal source and too few from plants. And in general, they could eat more cereals and more fruit and veggies. Luckily, for us, we drink just the right amount of water and tea, so we don't really need to adjust that. But on the other levels, we have quite some room for improvement. And when we compare these requirements from health with the requirements from environment, we can see that it does not contradict. So in general, if we try to eat more plants, more plant-based protein, more plant-based oils, we help our health and we also help the environment. And I think this is one key message that we really want to focus on in the strategy, that we do not solely focus on the environment, but we take into account the different aspects of sustainability. In food, we talked a lot, it's now about environment and health, but it's also about the social equity and also the economical feasibility that such a food system needs to have in order to survive in the future. About the environment, I've talked a lot. It's also about waste, but it's also about eating much more plant-based. Environment is about the same. And social equity, it's also about what we buy and where we buy. Also with the economy, it is important that we do not only make a food system that the rich third of the people in Zurich can have, but it's really important that everyone can participate in this food system. The city has set goals for itself. So we want to be a role model in our own restaurants. We want to have a sustainable supply chain in our food. And also we want to inform the public about sustainable food and also have projects and offerings and activities that all citizens can access. For this, the strategy has 5 fields of action. I'm just giving an overview. I'm sure in the discussion we can get closer into one or the other fields, whichever interest. We talk about information education. I think this is the basis, especially in schools, that we have school gardens, that we have education on sustainable development, but also that we have adequate training in people that are working in the food sector, both in the city's administration, but also in the whole city, and that we address the population and we reach the population and have a dialogue with people in the city itself. It is also important to cooperate and monitor closely. If we talk about cooperation, there are a lot of people in Zurich that are active in one or the other field that engage themselves to get a more sustainability in their business, in their farm, or they try to build a network. So we really should cooperate with each other to get a maximum of impact. And about the monitoring, it's always important to see if the things that we do actually work out. So we have an ongoing project that we try to assess for the first time what kind of food comes into Zurich, where does it come from, what type it is, and if all goes well, we will repeat that in a couple of years, and hopefully we will see a difference to 2020. Then there are 3 fields of action that are more focused on the food production chain itself. So there's one in the regional production and distribution. We have about 30 farms in Zurich. 1/10 of the area is actually for agriculture production. Then there are a lot of allotments, family gardens, school gardens, things like that. So people can get involved in food production. And there's, of course, a regional value chain. There are a lot of interesting new and old businesses that are part of this value chain. And I think more and more of this value chain will be located in Zurich. We have an important field of action in the procurement and catering sector, because in our own 450 restaurants, we want to be more sustainable. There are specific goals. I have written them down here. So we want to reduce the food waste and have less than 10% food waste. We want to have a healthy offer of menus. We want to procure 50% or more of the products with added value. And with all that, we want to reduce our environmental footprint clearly by 30% in the next 10 years. We would also like to support the food business outside of the city administration in reaching more sustainability and work towards this. And last but not least, I already talked about food waste. This is a very important topic. 1/3 of our food is wasted. So if we could avoid this, we would help the environment a lot already. So we also have actions there. We have a campaign. We work on the kitchen waste collection and things like that. Yes, 10 minutes, I hope.
Thank you so much for that. I think we can hear Laura before starting the conversation. I give you the...
Okay. Hello, everyone. Thank you. So my name's Laura. I'm one of the co-founders of Loflo chocolate here in Zurich. And I'm going to present you a little bit about our work. What we didn't talk about, are we going to do the degustation or not? We didn't decide before I start talking, and then as I want. Okay, then we do it. Because it's difficult to talk about chocolate, and at least you people in the room, if you want, you can get degustation chocolate over there. Don't start yet. Yeah, you see numbers on him. Okay, so we had a vision 6 years ago. Oops. We had a vision 6 years ago to give chocolate the value we think it deserves. We're quite a mixed group of people between the age of 25 and 54 when we founded the company. It took us 4 years to build the company, and now we're selling chocolate since 4 years. We're based in the city of Zurich, in Binz, in the Bäckerei Buchmann. We're in the old room where they used to make the croissants, and in there we installed our chocolate factory. It's a temporary space. We can be there for 2 more years, maybe a little bit longer. You're welcome to come and visit us. So the thing about Loflo is really to create a transparent chocolate factory. And what does that mean? It has a lot of different parts. It kind of starts from the origin. So what we do is we do direct trade, and direct trade most of the times, as with, for example, these farmers here in Colombia. These are a lot of different farmer groups that have been really hit hard by the political situation, very small farms. And what we do is we work with them directly. And this cacao arrived by sailboat to Europe. So I think talking about food transportation is always a really big issue. So we're trying to communicate already from that starting point. So I think when we talk about chocolate, and I'm here for 10 minutes, I think it's important that you guys just slightly understand what chocolate is. Chocolate comes from this beautiful tree, the Theobroma tree, and you can see there the fruit on the right side, and the fruit is opened up, and inside you have these seeds. Those seeds are fermented on the farm, and that's where quality really starts. We can't make good chocolate without the high quality that starts on the farm. The cacao is then dried and is then brought to Europe. This is how the cacao arrives in Zurich. This is the seed of the fruit. This is the healthy part. A lot of people forget that chocolate is not just sugar and a snack. It's actually a very healthy food. And that's what we try to also communicate with Loflo. When you peel the cacao bean, you get the nibs, the cacao nibs, which is on the right side. And that's where the production part starts in Zurich, is what we do is we roast the cacao nibs. We roast the nibs and then we add sugar. We work with local organic sugar instead of taking sugar from abroad. And then in this machine, it's called a stone mélangeur. You grind the cacao nib for 4 days, inclusive the sugar, and that's how the chocolate mass is created. It takes a long time to create chocolate. And the last part is then to put it into the chocolate bars. It's all done by hand. And what we do is we have open factory Thursday and Friday afternoon, so people can come and visit us in the city and come and see how we work. We believe that the value of good chocolate or any kind of food is very much connected when the consumer understands all the steps behind. The consumer doesn't have to understand all the steps, but it's an eye-opener for people when they understand how much work is behind a product. The value that is transmitted is a very different one. So this is our chocolate bar. We're part of this initiative that's called Made in Zurich. It's an initiative that started 2 years ago, and it's trying to bring I just forgot the word in English, Gewerbe, to take care that the city is not just about consumption and living, but that there's also more, not just craftsmanship, but people working other than offices in the city. And it's been a challenge for us to be able to keep the factory in the city, but we strongly believe that La Flor, for example, the way we built it up would never work if we're outside of the city, because we cannot communicate the correct value. So the point about eating chocolate is that you use all your senses, as with all good foods. So when you look at a product, I mean, sensory analysis, I studied at the Slow Food University. I did a master's in food culture and communications, and I plead you to all taste, smell, and look at your daily food, and you will discover much more pleasure in it. So with the bread, with the cheese, or with the chocolate, start looking at more of the ingredient lists and start looking what's inside, where does it come from, and hopefully, for example, with the chocolate you eat, it should be at least written the country it comes from, ideally more the farm. So what we do is we do single farm direct trade chocolate. So one farm, one chocolate. So if you want to start eating the first chocolate, number 1, these are all dark chocolates. There's no milk inside for anybody who has allergies. So if you have the chocolate in your hand, have a look at it. This is dark chocolate. There's nothing added to it, and then put it in. If you want to, smell at it first before you put it in your mouth, and just wait a second. It's difficult. It takes time, but it's nice. Also, next time you buy bread, smell at the bread. It's a very nice experience, or at the cheese. And then put it in your mouth, and then see what happens. I'm not going to taste any, unfortunately, but I already had some chocolate this morning, as every day. This chocolate is 74% cacao. And if 74% cacao, that means the rest is sugar. It's quite high percentage of cacao, but it's a very soft cacao. This is an autochtone variety from Ecuador, and it has a very nice like honey and malt flavor. We pay the farmer the double amount per kilo as we do, for example, as Fairtrade does. So they really have to, we pay for quality, and diversity, thank God, is reflected in diversity of flavor. So if you try this chocolate, this is the Hacienda Limon from Ecuador. You can see the color of the cacao fruit on the left top corner. It's all yellow. That's that one variety from Ecuador. If you try the next chocolate, and just pay attention to the flavors in your mouth, what happens. So on these pictures here, you can see again the cacao fruit, then the cacao bean. The bean is fermented and then dried. So This chocolate actually has less cacao inside than the one before, even if you would think it's stronger. And that's because of the variety of this cacao. It's actually a mix of different varieties. It's a 70% cacao from Fazenda Vera Cruz from Brazil. And if you look at the color of these fruits, there's a lot of different, you see the mix of the different colors. The owner of this farm is Roland Müller. He's a Swiss who immigrated about 20 years ago to Brazil. And he has very interesting working structures. He, for example, the families live on the farm and he pays the women higher salaries than he does the men, because he says they work better than the men do, more efficient. So this is he, for example, is organic certified. A lot of our farms are not, but they are. And this cacao is much more citrusy. It's like, it's not bitter, but it has like citrus aromas. So if you want to try the last one. So we have open factory Thursday and Friday from 3 to 6. So you're all welcome to come by and visit us and see the machines that we work with and try all the different chocolates. We make 8 different chocolates. I just brought you 3 today. So the last one, if you put it in your mouth, see what happens. The point I'm trying to show you is that these are all dark chocolates and they're all kind of done in the same way, but they taste very different. And I think that's the beauty of biodiversity and the beauty of cacao or any other fruit. And this is what we are trying to transfer at Loflo. This cacao comes from Venezuela. It's Finca Rodrigo. It's 73% cacao. So the strongest cacao we have. And here again, you can see a different fruit, different shape. This is a criollo variety. The fermentation boxes. And this cacao is very kind of spicy. Has like a little bit of cinnamon inside, a little bit whiskey flavor. So we're trying to communicate a lot through food. I think it's very important. We're trying to connect the farmers directly to the consumers, and doing that in a factory setting is challenging. We do a lot of events, we do tours, we do public events, private events, a lot of talks, and it works. People understand it. And this transparency of Loflo is kind of our goal and our daily aim, what we do. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Sorry for the audience. We maybe the students wants to start with a question.
Thank you very much, all of you, for your presentation. Our first question would be, you all talk about cheap food and slow food, and we asked ourselves the question, like, when we eliminate cheap food, like completely, how can people with like less income still afford food, or also like good quality food? Because for us nowadays, like bio products and slow food are still like luxury products. I mean, you sell chocolate bar for 9 francs, which we also understand, but maybe a further question to this would also be how people react to the price, and is there appreciation for like good working conditions and for locally produced goods in general? Maybe we would like to start with you, Laura.
This is my favorite topic. On Friday, I'm doing a tour on the market in Zurich where I prove that it's actually not expensive to eat well. It just takes a little bit more time and it takes a little bit more focus. It's the real price. I think we have to stop thinking about cheap price. It's the real price. If you go on the market, that's the real price of the farmers. I own another company called Sobremesa where we do a lot of that. I think I would like to give the stage also to Yvonne or Caroline. I'm sure they have, but I think it's a misconception and we have to stop thinking about cheap food and real costs of food. And you just start eating very differently. And our chocolate bar is expensive, but you can get cheaper, but then you eat sugar. With us, you eat cacao. So it's like, but I totally agree, the bar is expensive at the price, 9 francs, it's a proud price. But you can also get our ones without the packaging, the cost is much lower, for example.
Shall I cut in here?
Please go ahead.
Okay. Well, I completely agree with what Laura just said, and actually, in my very, very rapid presentation, in which I tried to sort of, as it were, describe how we've evolved through the shared problem of how to eat for, shall we say, the last 10,000 years and beyond. I think because the problem of how to eat is so profound, that one of the great projects of industrialization has been to try to make it appear to go away. So we've seen this creation of this, as I said in my talk, this fake idea of cheap food, which actually does not exist. It can only exist if, as a society, we decide to externalize its true costs. And as Laura just said, the only food that where currently all the real costs are embedded is, if you like, artisanally produced, organically produced local food. And it's not expensive. That is the true cost of food. Everything else is a lie, and we're paying for that lie with climate change and with the loss of biodiversity and with pollution and water depletion and all the other things that I didn't quite have time to enumerate, but I showed you in a slide. And I mean, for me, we've reached a point where this idea of a good life that we have, which actually comes from early industrialization. So if you read Adam Smith, for example, the father of capitalism, he says, well, all wealth comes from nature, but nature comes for free. And we've really been operating on this basis for the last 2.5 centuries, the idea that you can just plunder the natural world and it's fine. And of course, now with our global village vision, we realize, oh, it's actually the opposite of what Adam Smith said. Yes, he's correct. All wealth comes from nature, but actually far from coming from free, it's actually, we should be treating it as sacred and finding a balance between ourselves and it, because in fact, we are part of it. So my metaphor for a good society is one in which everyone gets to eat well, is really an argument for reinvesting the true value of food in food, which means all food starts to cost as much as Laura's chocolate bar, but that means all food is actually made like Laura's chocolate bar. In other words, it's paying the right amount to farmers, it's sustaining natural landscapes, it's giving people good jobs. And that, yes, is a revolutionary idea, because if you say food has to be more expensive, then, and yet you base your society around the idea that everyone deserves to eat well, that means you need other radical ideas. You need wealth redistribution, you need land reform, you need something that might be like a universal basic income or a much more generous minimum wage. It's a totally different vision of society. But I think this is a matter of survival. This is not a matter of choice. We have to go down this road. But the good news is there's a huge amount of pleasure to be gained from it too, because the weird thing, again, as I attempted to allude to briefly, is that in the externalization of the true cost of food, we're also externalizing the pleasure of food and the pleasure of craft and working with our hands and taking time and all the other things that capitalism excludes in the name of efficiency. So I do believe that the seeds of a good life are all there in the revaluing of food.
Okay.
So
May I? Yeah. May I just kind of do the roundup or the end? I quite agree with all that was said before, and a lot of things, those things are not easily to apply by the individual consumer right now. So I like to talk a bit about the aspects, what can I do as a consumer right now? And because I quite agree with this argument, I often raise the question myself, why does sustainability mean much more expensive? And of course, what you say, that is absolutely true. But when I am a student and I am in the shop, then I have to kind of use my resources responsibly, and then of course I don't buy the most expensive organic products. And I think the good thing is that eating more sustainable does not necessarily mean it's more expensive, because eating more sustainable is not only about buying organic products. I think this is a very important message. When we look at how we could reduce the environmental footprint of our food, the most important and most direct aspect is to reduce the food waste. And if we reduce the food waste, we also have less money that we have to spend on our food. So this is quite a simple measure. Secondly, and also one of the most important things for environment, is to reduce consumption of meat and other animal-based products. And in general, it is like that meat, especially in Switzerland, is one of the most expensive products at all. Mm-hmm. So if we reduce our meat consumption, we also do something good for our financial resources. And of course, if we would like and if we can afford it, then we could invest the money we saved in buying more or better produced products, better produced fruits, veggies, and occasionally maybe, if we like, some meat, but occasionally. So this is kind of what could you do today to be more sustainable and not spend much more money.
Yvonne, could you maybe develop on the, you said that to pay less, you need to, we need to do less waste. How do you work concretely with the companies? Is it the responsibility of each company to organize that, or like how is it?
Well, the companies is only one part. The major part of the food waste, almost 40%, is in the private households. So 40% of the food waste happens in the private households. So of course, each and every one can work there by itself, and it's really important not to start when the product's already bad, but really to start when buying, when shopping, when cooking, to use the things that you already have that are starting to go bad, use them before they actually do go bad. So that's one thing. And the other, what we do with the companies, we actually do food waste measurements in our own restaurants. So the people, they have to collect their food waste during 3 weeks and weight it and report it, with the clear goal that they get better over time and waste less. So yes, that's what we actually do, like in action that we do as a city in our own food businesses like that. Yeah. Does that answer your question?
Yes. To
Hello, I continue. So I feel like me and my fellow friends and colleagues are getting more and more conscious about what you just said, not throwing food away, about eating local food, eating less meat. But I feel like we're also living in this bubble together. So next question would be, how is it possible to bring the topic to the mass population? And Yvonne, earlier you talked about those programs the city has and about information education. Can you give us a few examples about that?
Yes, very. Thank you for the question. Of course, well, one important part, but it's not with immediate action, is the schools. So we educate the students, or the how do you call the smaller students, the kids when they're in school, about sustainability, sustainable food. We also in Zurich, many kids eat in school, so we it is really important that the things they get to eat in school are according to what they learn, so that it's sustainable and healthy and wholesome. So this is one, but of course this does not really result in immediate action, because those kids, they have to grow up and before they buy themselves. But it is really important for the next 10, 20 years. There's with the new, I have to speak these words in German because I don't know them in English, the new Lehrplan 21. So this is kind of the framework for how to educate the pupils. It has an own topic about education for sustainability. And this gains much more weight in the upcoming years. And I think this is a very good development. And in this part, we also want to focus more on environmentally friendly food. The Canton of Zurich, for example, has now made a composition of relevant programs and teaching books that the teachers can actually use. So this is very practical thing that is going on. For the general public, we do different things. So for one, of course, me and my team, we take every opportunity to get in touch with the public, to participate in events, in discussions, or also we sponsor some discussions about sustainability, sustainable food. Then also we have campaigns that are going on. Currently there's a national campaign against food waste running, and we are also partner of this campaign and use this campaign. For example, starting in the next couple of weeks, given the situation of Corona, maybe with less publicity, but there will be how do you say, doggy bags in restaurants that are branded with this food waste campaign. So people in the restaurants actually like see that food waste is a topic. Yeah, this is just a few examples on what we actually do, how we try to reach the public. What we also start, or we have to postpone it to next year, but wanted to start this year is we go into the different areas, Quartier, how do you say, neighborhoods, and they have events there. They have events for people that are new to the neighborhood, or they have events for families or festivals and things like that. So the Rönckenplatzfest or Ida-Platzfest, things like this. And we kind of offer them a sustainable food kit that they can integrate in their event. So we don't do a special event on sustainable food, but we kind of offer elements that they can take and adapt to their own events, and so they can get the topic to people that are maybe not in the bubble, in the food bubble right now. So these are just a few ideas. We have more things going on, but I don't want to monopolize the discussion.
Shall I say something to that question?
Yes, perfect.
I mean, it's really lovely to hear what Yvonne's doing in Zurich, and I really would love to see every city doing something similar. I think, you know, cities, it's quite interesting, they're quite a good scale at which to kind of answer these sorts of questions. But I also believe we need a more fundamental shift in our value system altogether. And as Yvonne says, it's still kind of in the bubble, you know, we're still fighting against this invisible thing called what I would call the capitalist derived idea of a good life, you know, in which, you know, not just food, but actually anything else that's necessary to life is seen as, you know, the ideal cost is seen as zero. And that includes, of course, the human labor that goes into it and the materials that go into it. So I think on top of all the wonderful work that Yvonne is doing, we need what I would describe it as a kind of a deep cultural shift. And among these things is, you know, really going back to the basis of asking the question of what a good life is, because it's really interesting if we're trying to transition from where we are now to zero carbon, you know, ideally tomorrow, but clearly not tomorrow, but, you know, maybe if we're lucky by kind of 2050, then we have to take people with us. It has to be about pleasure. It has to be about, you know, people actually wanting to do this. And I think that's where I come back to ideas that, you know, when you talk about them sound deeply revolutionary. So, I mean, Yvonne's talked very eloquently about all the things that you can do. And I deeply echo what she just said about as individuals now, you know, just by eating less meat and dairy, for example, and more grains and pulses, and also obviously learning to cook or being taught to cook is a major part of it. But at a cultural level, which means a political and economic level, I think we need to deeply question our idea of a good life. And it has come up briefly today. I think actually Laura mentioned it, the idea that we're not just consumers of things, we're also makers of things. And in order to make stuff, you need space. And actually in my book, I'm arguing for land reform, as I said, and also wealth redistribution, because, you know, I think one of the things that COVID has made very obvious is the deep inequalities in society. And we have a whole generation. I mean, I imagine most of your students, Adam, are of a generation where they're thinking, am I going to have a job? Am I ever going to be able to afford to buy anywhere to live? You know, where is my place in the world? And this is a deep failure of society. So there are many things that need to happen. But for me, to sort of say, to go to food and use food as a lens, because otherwise it gets almost too big to contemplate and say, well, everyone has to eat every day. Everyone has to consume food every day. It's the one thing, in fact, we all have to consume every day. And therefore, by valuing it, you know, putting it at the center of our economics, and using that as our distributive, you know, not money, which is a very kind of weird, slippery thing that you can just print more of if you need it or borrow, or, you know, money doesn't actually exist, weirdly. It just represents other things, whereas food is real. So if we put most of the value of our economics back in food, and say everyone deserves to eat well, then a huge amount can flow from this, allowing us to start to rebuild a different idea of a good life that's about having a place in the world, having space, having the opportunity to make, because of course food is the low-hanging fruit, not to wish to use too corny an analogy, of the part of our lives where, you know, there's always going to be an economy and there's always going to be an opportunity to work. And if we value food and therefore pay the correct amount for food, then it can generate a huge number of very rewarding jobs. But alongside that, as I said, we need to give people access to land. I mean, a lot of people we've seen, you know, in the evolution of the food movement over the last 30 years in European, you know, in the West, effectively, people saying they want to eat better and they want organic and they want, you know, more authentic food. We've seen the evolution of this food movement, which is a very strong movement, but it's still a bubble. So I think it's kind of bursting the bubble and actually saying that, you know, good food is not for just people who want to kind of fetishize it or have the money, but it's for everyone. And it's actually about a vision. I mean, it's very interesting. I think the anarchists are very interesting on this. You know, it's about a vision of a good life that's much more about, rather than generating an abstract thing called wealth, it's actually about developing a roundness of life for individual people within communities. So we need access to land. I happen to know, I mean, there's lots and lots of people who would want to farm if we valued food and paid, they could earn a decent living and could get access to land. And we need more people living on the land because we need, you know, we need more stewardship of the land, and we need to farm in ways that is much more, just as Laura was saying about being conscious of the chocolate, we need to be conscious of the landscape and conscious of nature. And that's where a lot of the pleasure and meaning of life comes. So sorry, I'm talking for a long time, therefore I'll stop. But just to say that actually this is deep, it's revolutionary, it's about a necessary change. And it doesn't have to be scary, but I think it's about going back to the basics of asking what a good life is. And that's political, of course.
I think maybe to add on what you're saying, the revolution, I think it's actually very easy. And the point is that eating healthy, which means vegetables, fruits, and pulses, those are not the foods that cost a lot, even if you buy the organic ones. If you go to the market and you buy what's seasonal, the kilo price is lower than what you pay in the supermarket. So if you really pay attention and you really want to eat sustainable, well, and the point is the food is so good, you'll never want to go back. So actually it's just plus, 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 plus. There is no negative in it. And a lot of people say, well, it's so expensive to eat well. It's not true. But unfortunately, it's really hard for people to go that path. There's different small organizations that help you go through that path, but I think people have to do it individually. People have to do it in groups and families. I've seen the transformation around me. I see it daily. It's very beautiful. It starts with what I cook for lunch for my staff. We don't eat animal products, very seldom, and it works. People are very healthy. They're very happy, and I don't spend a lot of money on it. So the point of, I love this topic. Yes. Did that answer?
No, that's very clear, but I just want to add something. As being somebody who's in, say, London and in Zurich, we don't have someone like Yvonne in London. And if there was someone like Yvonne in London, they wouldn't have the kind of means, for instance, your network of restaurants, they wouldn't have the means to by themselves actually enact some of these experimental, transformative processes. And I don't want to idealize Switzerland because there's lots of things about Switzerland that are not perfect. But compared to Britain, Britain has the condition of kind of profound alienation from food amongst the majority of the population. So when I found myself in an area like outside of the city, and we were on holiday and we were on the way to somewhere, and I had to buy a chicken, let's say, because there really wasn't much available. So you go into a lousy supermarket in the middle of nowhere, and the chickens, none of them were fit to eat. And that's what was being sold in this normal area where people undoubtedly didn't have very much money. The chickens were cheap, but they weren't so cheap. They weren't free. They certainly weren't worth anything. You know, they had no value. And you can even go to parts of East London, you know, which are very gentrified, some parts, but if you go to the normal food stores in East London, things like vegetables are more expensive than they are at the supermarket I shop at. So it is like a conspiracy where poor populations are being really forced to eat bad food because it's to do with the distribution, it's to do with these huge agro businesses controlling the ends of the retail chain, all sorts of things like that. It's really shocking because like I sort of live in a bubble in London. I'm not at the top of the bubble, I'm in the middle of it. But when I occasionally go outside of it, even in a city like London, you see incredible impoverishment economically, but also in terms of possibility.
Well, this is a very, it's good to hear that first time, because when we did our research on how should we do the sustainable food strategy, I did read about the so-called food deserts that apparently are also in England. And this is just what you described, that people, they live in neighborhoods where they can't shop wholesome, healthy food. They simply don't have a store that offers fruit and veggies in a sufficient quality or offers it at all because it has only convenience food or things like that. And I think in Zurich, we are in really lucky position because I'm quite confident that most people have access to a store that sells a salad and a carrot and something healthy and wholesome, even if it's not organic. But I mean, it's not even thinkable for us that we don't have a store that has these sort of things.
I mean, I'd love to leap in here because I talk about this subject a lot, and I work in Europe a lot, actually. I mean, the place that unfortunately British people don't seem to think they want to belong to, despite the geography. But, you know, Britain is in a very interesting position because basically we industrialized before any other country on earth, as you know. And of course, if you think about where food comes from, it comes from the countryside, and people were forcibly moved out of the countryside to go and work in factories, which made them dependent on industrial food, which was then being invented in America. And in fact, you know, as soon as canned foods became available, or sort of cheap industrial meat, we were the biggest importers of it in the UK. And in fact, you know, also interestingly, because of our quote unquote special relationship with the USA, we were the only country in Europe that didn't put laws in place limiting supermarket development in the 1970s and onwards. In fact, our first law limiting supermarket development came in the mid-1990s, incredibly. So I think everything, and also we have the most unequal society in Europe, because I mean, again, I often talk about this kind of stuff in relation to food and geography, because, you know, we had this free trade attitude to feeding ourselves because we were a maritime nation. We were always able to sort of bring food in from wherever. And so that kind of, you know, that sort of built then on this kind of deracination of our food culture. And the last thing that happened, by the way, is that during the French Revolution, all the chefs who had been cooking for the French nobility went around Europe, and we sort of embraced them in Britain. So you have a situation, I mean, if you think of a healthy culture, it's vertical, you know, it begins with peasantry and the land, and it aspires to something fine up here, like, you know, which used to be historically what the nobles, what the king ate, as it were. And in between, you have this kind of negotiation. And we lost the basis of our food culture 250 years ago with industrialization. Then we lost the top of it with the diaspora of French chefs coming to the UK. So posh food was no longer English, but French. And so in the middle, we just had this kind of, it's like the loss of biodiversity in a natural ecosystem. We had the loss of cultural diversity and belief and value. And so when America kind of invented this new one-size-fits-all fast food culture and supermarket culture, we totally embraced it. So, you know, that's all going on top of, you know, as Adam says, you know, deep inequality. And this weird idea that Laura keeps repeating correctly, which is that, you know, fast food is cheap. I mean, you know, it's outrageous how expensive fast food is compared to how you could feed yourself if you had the knowledge to just buy, as you say, local seasonal veggies in a market and you know, some beans and pulses. You can eat incredibly healthily on very little if you have the knowledge. But as Adam says, you know, there are vast areas of food desert in British cities where you can't get the fresh food. So it's a kind of it's a perfect storm of bad stuff, but it's also going global, which is why I show my sort of scary hamburger image, because, you know, this kind of deracinated industrial food model is what is being exported all around the world, and that is where all the profits in food are. So, I mean, that's what you're up against, really, when you're trying to establish a kind of a healthy local food system.
So one question from the chat, which is quite similar to one we also have, is from Martina. Laura says that appreciation of a product is much higher when the working process is made visible. Why, Carolyn and Yvonne, from your different positions, do you believe working processes are very often hidden or else normalized in media, or romanticized, sorry. And we were also asking ourselves, what would change if the whole chain of food production and food delivery would be transparent nowadays in the city and elsewhere? So maybe, Carolyn, would you like to start?
Yeah, sure. I mean, actually, I write about this extensively in both my books. I think it's a really interesting question. I'm going to go back to hunter-gatherers, believe it or not. I mean, what's interesting about hunter-gatherer societies, which the more I think about it, the more I think was kind of the high point of human civilization in many ways. The people who were the best hunters were also the natural leaders. So we're talking about largely unhierarchical societies. What you get with the evolution of farming and urbanity is a kind of hierarchy where the people who produce the food are very quickly enslaved, effectively. They're sort of put on the bottom rung of society, and the people who control the food, who are, you know, in the world's first cities, the people in the temple, they have the power. So we establish with urbanity this kind of idea that actually to be actively involved in food production is for the lower classes or people who, you know, don't have the power. And we still have this weird idea. And I think then that gets reinforced through history with, if you like, the kind of the dream that, you know, the question of how to eat has kind of been solved, you know. And I mean, even today we see, you know, I mean, the kind of, you know, I briefly showed, for example, Rob Reinhardt, the inventor of Soylent, you know, saying to worry about something as simple as food in the digital age is weird, which to me is just the craziest way of thinking. I mean, you know, food is not simple. But, you know, he thinks you can just solve food with technology, which I find really interesting. But I mean, that's no different in a way to the peasant dream, you know, of the land of cocaine, which was a kind, I mean, if you like, goes back to the kind of the dream of the Garden of Eden, the dream that we've solved the problem of how to eat and the world will just feed us without us having to work. And of course, that comes with farming and the idea of work, which, as I say, is associated with agrarianism, interestingly. So I think, you know, the reason why we like to behave as if we're medieval kings, you know, just 2 in the morning kind of go, ooh, I fancy a Thai curry, and we just order it up on Deliveroo, and some slave with a sort of peppermint green box on their back sort of cycles through the rain to bring us our feast at 2 in the morning. You know, I mean, this is a sort of, it's a deeply corrupt sort of throwback to the idea that not having to think about food is actually a high status thing. And you see a counter revolution to this, interestingly, with, of course, you know, what I call cookery porn, which is all the cheap. I mean, again, it's worse in the UK than anywhere else in Europe, because we've got a more industrialized food culture than anywhere else in Europe. But, you know, we sit and watch kind of people taking endless hours kind of making all this artisanal food, and we'll do that for entertainment, but we actually, most of us don't actually do it ourselves. So again, it's sort of, it's partly that, it's also partly not wanting to acknowledge the fact that, you know, life takes death, because in the West we've got this sort of denial of death thing going on, which is very interesting in relation to COVID as well. So that comes with the railways. So pre-railways, the only way you could get animals into the city was for them to walk in live, and then be slaughtered in front of your face, basically. So you couldn't ignore the fact that you were, as it were, engaging in death in order to live. But as we know, progressively after the railways came, so animals could be slaughtered outside the city, Europeans got progressively squeamish. And this, interestingly, is a word that doesn't appear to exist in the Netherlands, but, you know, it definitely exists in the USA and in the UK. This idea that you don't want to have to think that what you're eating used to once be a living being, particularly not an animal. So we won't eat the, you know, anything with eyes in, or kind of feet or offal or anything that kind of reminds us of anatomy. We just want our meat to come as a sort of slab of anonymous protein, at which point, you know, arguably you may as well just have a kind of, you know, a bit of protein manufactured in a lab, although there's a whole series of other things associated, you know, problematics associated with that as well. So it's really, really complex and really, really interesting. But I would say in summary, it's to do with our denial of the reality of what it takes to sustain us as human beings. And I think this is a fundamental problem in our value system as well, that we need to address. And also we're missing out on the joy of making stuff, which is also fundamental.
Well, if I may add on or also have a view on this question, I'm quite sure that the working process or the production process of food items, if they're known by people, that also generates interest that goes beyond this individual production process. So I'm not sure if people really need to know each and every one production step of each and every item that they do eat, but I'm confident that they need a glimpse into different production processes, and that it's important also, especially for the kids, that they learn where food comes from, what it takes to produce food, and for all citizens of Zurich, that if they want, that they can also engage themselves into some form of food production. So I kind of agree with Laura that the more insight into the production is quite important, and we would also like to have more transparency in general. So like, it is possible to have tomato, a glass of tomato from Italy, but the tomatoes are actually from China because it was filled in Italy, and then they can write Italy on it. So I don't really like those kind of things, and we would really like if this kind of transparency would get more, so that we actually know where the food comes from that we eat and buy. One further step in transparency which I would appreciate was also if the hidden costs or the external costs, namely on environmental impact, were visible on the food. So we could think about some environmental footprint like thing or a CO2 footprint at the minimum on the food. So I think this would be quite interesting for people, because I noticed that many people don't really know which food contributes how much to the climate gas emissions. So there are actually people that do think, and this was a study from ETH Zurich, there are many consumers that do think that conventional tofu is more or is worse in terms of climate gas emissions than a bio meat patty. So did I say it right? Yes, I think I did say it right. So they think that the conventional tofu emits more CO2 than a bio, let's say, beef patty or something like that. So I think that's quite problematic. And if people knew more about this, I think they would also change their behavior in buying products.
Okay, so I have a question for you, Carolyn. So in hungry cities, you're talking about how waste is back on the urban agenda, but the city is not designed for recycling. So I was wondering if you could talk a bit about how waste logistics and relate to the city.
Yeah. Well, I mean, again, I'm sort of resting on the shoulders of people who've really looked at the problem of waste from the bottom up, as it were. I mean, notably Tristram Stewart, who wrote a book just called Waste, which came out probably about 10 years ago now. But I mean, he's super interesting on this subject if you're particularly interested in this. I mean, essentially in the old days, basically how you ran a city in terms of waste is you absolutely tried to recycle as much as you could, because most waste was organic, and people understood the need to conserve human and animal manure and dump it on the land. So I mean, actually, people have written about the medieval city as a kind of, ideal sort of ecological loop, because human and animal waste, I mean, organic materials in general were mostly what the city produced, and it was generally conserved. Exceptions to that would have been cities like London as they started to grow bigger. But I mean, again, a lot of this is to do with geography, but London was on the Thames was navigable, which meant it was very easy for London to import its food from a long way away. And because the cities didn't struggle to feed itself in that sense, it chucked a lot of its sewage into the Thames, and it just got rid of its sewage. And it's very interesting. There's a long historical discussion between Paris and London on this topic, because the Seine is not navigable. So Paris wasn't able to import its food easily from abroad, but it also wasn't able to get rid of its sewage either. And well, to cut a long story short, what Paris ended up doing was building a very elaborate kind of sewage works, effectively, just down river of the city, at a place whose name now escapes me, but it's something like Gennevilliers, I think, which was very unproductive. It was just kind of like sandbanks. But because it began to receive all of the city's manure, which the farmers, by the way, originally didn't want. They fought against it, but eventually they were paid by the city to take it. And then they started to grow these incredibly rich kind of vegetable, I mean, they basically became the market garden of Paris, and became extremely famous, and all the best hotels and restaurants were buying their vegetables from there. So that's really interesting. And when London built its sewage system, interestingly, Victor Hugo who was a bit of a sort of sewer obsessive, by the way. In the middle of Les Miserables, he has a sort of 90-page long essay on sewers, just kind of in the middle of the action, which is completely brilliant. But he actually wrote to the British Prime Minister and said, for goodness sake, don't just channel your sewage away out of the city, because that is really vital nutrients that you're getting rid of. And I think, you know, I mean, it's now becoming the case, for example, that phosphorus, which is one of the key nutrients for plants, we're running out of natural sources of it. So mined phosphorus is getting very rare. And the next most available, sort of easily available source for us is in human shit, basically. So people are starting to look really closely at this question of what we do with our waste, the organic side, and actually saying we may have to start extracting a lot more from waste in order to sort of bring it back into the productive cycle. You know, that's one side of it. And of course, you know, with industrialization, you get the added problematic of other forms of waste that are not organic, you know, notably plastic. I think we're all sort of becoming incredibly aware now that the plastic is a material that we just have to start dealing with completely differently. And, you know, we have landfill, you know, we have this sort of one-way mentality of, you know, inputs in, inputs out, and they're never seen again. And of course, you know, as well, people have been arguing for at least 50 years now, we need to sort of start thinking of economies and natural systems as cycles again. And it's a big rethink, you know, in terms of, you know, not single use anything, basically. Food is never single use, you know, because it comes from nature and it goes back to nature. But, you know, the need to eradicate single use materials from our lives entirely, and to only use materials effectively that we can recapture and reuse, which is just it's a different mentality. And again, it goes very much alongside what I was saying earlier about rethinking our idea of a good life being based only on consumption and not on production as well, and bringing those two things together. And by the way, I mean, you know, another book I would highly recommend, because it's still deeply relevant despite having been written 50 years ago, is E.F. Schumacher's Small is Beautiful. His opening sentence is, one of the greatest mistakes of the modern age is to assume that the problem of production has been solved. And kind of everything you need to know is in there, really.
Do you have another question? Yeah, go.
Maybe, okay. For Yvonne, I have a question, because you said before that about 40% of the waste is made by the consumer, but there's also about 40% of waste made in production lines. For example, foreigners whose tomatoes are rejected because they're not aesthetically pleasing. Does the city of Zurich have any strategy to tackle this? Or this waste of products because they're not aesthetically pleasing enough?
We don't have a specific strategy to like change those quality parameters. Of course, I do agree with you that it's not a good reason to throw away tomatoes because they don't look nice. But the city of Zurich does not also have the power in itself to like change this whole system. But of course, we do not approve of that type of waste. Yes. We have also engaged, or in our communication, we often name also this topic, that you can also buy fruit and veggies that don't look like perfectly and shiny new. We also say this in how do you say, education with our own kitchen staffs, namely with the organic fruit and veggies, because these are often more prone to not looking as nice, because they're not how do you say, treated as often with pesticides. So yes, but we don't really have the leverage to change those quality norms.
Just to leap in very briefly, I promise. There's actually several approaches to this problem in the UK. One is an organic box scheme, and I'm afraid the name's flown out of my head, but what they literally specialize in is outsized fruits. So fruits that just don't, for some reason or other, fit into the supermarket category. And that's doing very well. And the other one is actually certain supermarkets in the UK have actually got lines now, which is explicitly for kind of ugly fruit, quote unquote. So you can buy them, and they're just kind of their mixed sizes or whatever. So there are some initiatives in the UK on that precise problem.
Yeah, I just have a last question, maybe just a larger one, because we have been like in the studio, we have been looking at the cave paintings from different sides, like time of the of her history, and questioning the relationship to nature, and more precisely the where we cohabitate with plants but animals as well in the city. And I wanted to know what's your thinking of what's come next. Do you think we should radically change our anthropocentrism, like a way of cohabiting with plants and animals? And yeah, I mean, that would be a question also for Yvonne with her scientific background. That would be also interesting to hear, and Carolyn, of course.
Okay. Could you repeat? I didn't understand. Just a short repetition.
I'm just wondering about if we should radically change the way, like a relationship to the plants and animals, as we are really center of our own, an own vision of like human vision of it.
Well, personally, me as a scientist, I'm not. I don't think I'm an authority on saying how we should, like, how our relationship should change. It's, for me, this is difficult to name. But what I can say from a scientific point of view is that we could change our food system, make it more sustainable, without changing like everything around it. There is a really interesting publication from the Lancet Food Commission. They calculated which parameters we should change by 2050 to reach a sustainable food system. Sustainable meaning that the planet, for planetary health, let's say. And the 3 key points are: we should have the food waste, we should improve the productions, so we have less impact in producing the same amount of food, and we should switch to a healthy diet, meaning less animal products, more pulses, more fruits and veggies, what we talked about. So from this kind of naked numbers point of view, no, there's no need for a fundamental change to reach a more environmental friendly food system. But of course, then we have not talked yet about farmers. We haven't talked yet about livelihood. We have not talked about the global south. We have not talked about animal welfare. So yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, I that's really interesting. I mean, I would slightly have a different angle on that. I think we radically do need to rethink our relationship with nature, and I actually write about this extensively in my book, Sitopia, because I think we've inherited this kind of, again, I mean, it's very interesting. I keep going back into history to understand how we got where we are. And I think the Enlightenment is a kind of a very dualistic inheritance, because on the one hand, it's given us this amazing power to transform nature and so on. But also, if you look at Descartes, you know, he explicitly places humans outside nature, kind of like this all-seeing kind of eye that can sort of see the Cartesian grid and manipulate it at will. And I think, you know, that's what we're discovering is a bit of a mistake. You know, in other words, to think of ourselves as separate from nature, which is really very much the kind of industrialist tech fixie sort of thinking, and to actually understand that we're part of nature again. And I think a lot of the evolving discovery of, for example, the complexity of the microbiome and how that relates directly to the complexity of living soil, for example, is a really profound sort of, you know, it signals the potential of a really profound cultural and philosophical shift. And I think, you know, our philosophy and always marches in step with our technology in a sense. And I think, you know, now I would say we have a philosophy deficit rather than a technological one. In other words, we've got the technology to live well, but we don't have the philosophy to live well. So I am actually arguing for a radical, through again the lens of food, because food, of course, is the thing that connects us most directly and obviously with nature, to radically rethink our relationship with the natural world. And Yvonne's right, of course. I mean, we haven't mentioned the global south very much today, but of course, you know, I mean, it's understanding that you know, we are now living in an unambiguously global world, and you know, and I think part of our duty in the West is to sort of rethink the vision of a good life, which is currently being adopted globally, and is deeply destructive. So I would say, you know, we're probably not going to have a chance today to talk about, you know, other issues to do explicitly with the global south, but you know, there's inequality globally as well as within our own societies. And again, food sits at the nexus of our social relationships too. So I think, you know, there's a radical need to rethink our social relationships globally, and a radical need to rethink our relationship with nature globally. And we can do them both through food. And that's why revaluing food and thinking through food is so powerful.
Thank you so much. I think we have to come to an end. There are a lot of questions that we couldn't answer in the chat. Maybe you could write us an email or on the YouTube channel, and I mean, it would be interesting for us to continue the conversation. Maybe.
Thank you all so much for participating. It was really fascinating, and obviously it's a huge subject and we only scratched the surface, but I think it was really interesting. Thank you very much.
Pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Bye.
Thanks for having me.